We're listening live from Lethbridge, and you can download our free app on Android and iPhone, or by going to www.jessfm.ca. We are also live on YouTube and Facebook. The views and opinions expressed here are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Jess FM, Jess TV, its affiliates, or its employees. I would also like to remind everyone that certain topics may offend some listeners. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our show, For the Love of Poetry on Jess FM in Lethbridge, Alberta, where you can find out about local poets and hear their poetry. I am your host, Teri Petz, and this is my guest, Charissage. A few words about me. When I start talking, most people ask me where my accent is from, and when they find out I have been here in Canada for 30 years, they wonder why I still have an accent. I grew up in Hungary with a German background. I haven't lost my accent because I was an adult when I learned English. And now, let me introduce our guest, Charissage. Kat is a contemplative educator, artist, and counselor in the depth dimension of life, in creative and spiritual growth, including recovery from trauma. She is a mentor in self-directed education and has degrees in theology and education. She is a poet, a writer, and a visual artist. She hosts art-based groups in many areas and uses art for self-exploration and as a therapeutic tool. Kat and I will talk about poetry, and we will read some poems to you. I'd like to ask you, Kat, about what poems made you like poetry, and how old were you when you first started to like poetry?
Well, I grew up in a home that was very academic in some ways, and I was a good student. So it was the time when good students, especially young women students, were really encouraged to go into the sciences. So from the time I was little, I was going to be a physician. As you can see, that didn't work out that well. But in our home, we had a series of books called Junior Classics that probably many people our age would remember from being in their home. And I used to like to read them, but poetry in our family was just never, ever talked about. There was one poem, though, in those Junior Classics that really got me because of the rhythm of it all. So it was, light the lamps up, lamplighter. The people are out in the street. Without a light, they have no sight, and where will they plant their feet? Some will lie in the gutter, and some on the street. Oh dear, light the lamps up, lamplighter, because the night is here. Well, that's just the first stanza of a 3-stanza poem by Eleanor Farjeon. And I don't even know why I remember it, except that I've just always known that. But it's the rhythm of it all. And then, of course, in high school and in university, I was really interested in playing the guitar and writing some songs. And I never thought of that as poetry, but it really was. As an adult, I worked at a sexual assault center for many years. And during that time, we found that if you could get a phrase or a paragraph or a poem that was very poignant in some way, that our clients would be able to hold that in their hearts and use it as a touchstone for healing. That was about the time when Mary Oliver started to become more popular, and her particular poem, Wild Geese, it just felt like my heart's cry. I was raised as a good Catholic girl, and while I still treasure that background, I'm not a churchgoer at this time in my life. But the the first part of that poem, where you do not have to be good, you do not have to walk on your knees across a desert for 100 miles repenting, was always something that struck me really deeply as truth, because who we are deep down is good. And if we have the opportunity in our lives to live that out, well, then we can be good for others as well. So it was that particular poem that really struck me through the years. I never really wrote a lot of poetry because I think at that time, because I think that I had thoroughly integrated that idea that you couldn't make any money from poetry, there wasn't anything really important about it. It was for people who couldn't do anything else. A little bit like the twisted ideas of child rearing that we have now. You know, right now we pay child care workers less than we pay garbage workers, and yet they are helping nurture our future. But anyway, and that was what poetry was like, in the sense that while I believe now that it is of deep, deep value for anyone, that it is not seen as very valuable. It's certainly not in the at Christmas time, when everybody's going to malls all the time, and it happens to be more about consumerism than it is about soul work. Anyway, and what about you? I think you've been writing poetry for forever, haven't you?
Well, almost forever. And my love for poetry started when I was very young. The Hungarian language is beautiful, rich in imagery, and very poetic. I discovered the power of words when I was a child, and I excelled at languages, literature, and music.
Right.
I started to recite poetry when I was very young, probably in kindergarten.
Wow.
One of my first love, one of the first poems I memorized and still remember is, in Hungarian it's called Nem tudhatom, and in English there's many titles for it, and many translations, and I'm going to read one that was translated by Gina Gönzi. She's a young lady who lives in Montreal, and her translation spoke more to me than any of the others so far. In English it's called I Cannot Know. The poem is written by Miklós Radnóti, who was a Jewish Hungarian poet, and he wrote this poem on January 17th in 1944. Try
So
to
during the
imagine
war.
the surrounding. It was during war. He was taken by the Nazis and put into not a concentration camp, but a work camp.
Did he survive the war?
No, unfortunately, he didn't make it. He was shot in Hungary during what they called the forced march, and he was thrown in a mass grave. And I don't remember how many years later, but they found his body, and in his trench coat there was a little book, and it was his last poems he wrote before he died.
Wow. Just before you read, I just want to mention that as a little kid growing up, I don't know if it was seeing all the spy shows on TV, which were popular when I was growing up, or what, but I always had this vision or fantasy that I was in prison, and that getting a little piece of paper to write down, my thoughts was really hard, and that, we would take the cigarette papers and, write on that, and using charcoal for that. That was a huge part of my awareness growing up, is just, in a way, how precious it is to be able to express ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. It always was, and it always will be. It's so much part of our intricate life. So the poem is called I Cannot Know. It was written by Miklós Radnóti and translated by Gina Gönzi. I cannot know what this land means to other people. For me, It is my birthplace, this little nation embraced by flames, the world of my childhood rocking in the distance. I grew out of her like a tender branch from a tree, and I hope one day my body will sink into her. I am at home, and if a shrub happens to kneel down beside my foot, I know both its name and its flower. I know who walks on the road and where they are going, and what it might mean when in the summer sunset the house walls shimmer and drip with crimson agony. For one who flies above, this land is merely a map, and does not know where lived Vörös Marty Mihály, who was a Hungarian poet. What does this map hold for him? Factories and wild barracks, but for me, crickets, oxen, steeples, peaceful homesteads. He sees factories in his lenses and cultivated meadows, while I see the worker too, who for his work trembles. Forests, singing orchards, grapes and cemeteries. Among the grapes an old woman who quietly weeps. And what seems from above train tracks to destroy is a conductor's house, and he stands outside and signals. Many kids surround him, a red flag in his hand, and in the courtyard a commodore rolls in the sand. And there's the park, the footsteps of long-lost loves, the kisses on my mouth, both honey and cranberry. And walking off to school on the edge of the road, to avoid being called upon, I stepped on a stone. Look, here's the stone, but from above this cannot be seen. There is no machine with which all this can be revealed. For we are guilty too, as other peoples are, knowing full well when, how, and why we sinned so far. But workers live here too, and poets without sin, and tiny babies in whom intellect will flourish. It shines in them, and they guard it, hiding in dark cellars, until the finger of peace once again marks our nation. And with fresh voices, they will answer our muffled words. Cover us with your big wings, vigil-keeping evening cloud.
It's beautiful. The images in there are very evocative.
Well, back to you, Kat. You talked about your favorite childhood poems, but I'm curious about what inspires your writing.
I've begun writing poetry in earnest in the last maybe 5 years. It started with my learning to paint. What happened was that I lived with a number of chronic illnesses, including chronic pain, and about 5 years ago, winter started coming, and I felt the seasonal depression starting to roll in, and I was thinking, I've got to head this off, prevent this in some way. So I knew I kept asking myself, what do I need? What do I need? I need color. How do I get color? What do I need about color? And I remembered a painter that I had met at a conference about a year and a half before that. So I thought, I wonder if she has anything online. And her name is Shiloh Sophia McLeod, and she does have a lot online. She teaches art courses online. So I signed up for a number of her courses and opened up a whole new way of expression for myself and was able to indulge in the love of color. Well, her way of teaching unites both the image-making part of ourselves as well as the verbal speaking point of ourselves. And she encouraged all of her students to write poetry that goes along with the paintings that she does. So I started to do that, and as things go, one thing led to another. It's a whole lot easier to carry a piece of paper and a pen around than it is to carry your canvas and all your paints. So it's a portable art. But what inspires me now so much is in a world where our own lives are often a struggle, and yet our own lives here in Lethbridge, Alberta, here in Canada, are probably some of the most privileged in all of the world that has ever been. And so we can take our frustrations and know that in the world there are many people suffering things that are even greater than that. So what do we do with that? How do we keep going? I know that for my son and for myself at times, when I think of all of that, I just think, well, why don't we just all shoot ourselves now? I mean, we're all going to be dead anyway. Let's get rid of the suffering in the meantime. And of course, that's a nihilistic way of looking at the world that I really don't want to do. So what do? I look for hope. I look for the goodness. I look for any moment that there's a real interaction with people, that connection that you make eyeball to eyeball. And that's actually the magic of what happens in my story circles, because there's little to no technology. There's real people who are invited to share, but who have many choice points as to how much they share. And what it does is I'll finish a session, and I'll be inspired just by the goodness that happened there to somehow capture that. The poem that you read actually reminded me one that I wrote not too long ago about ways of looking at the world, when he was talking about how his colleague just sees factories and working, how he sees the landscape and the plants and the animals. Can I read it now?
Yes, of course. Please do that.
It's called Dream Come True. Last night I dreamt that as I got ready to go to bed, I looked out the window. I saw the most astounding flash of lightning. Silence. The stark white against the dark sky. It was like an upside-down tree with dozens of branches, or a river seen from the top of a mountain, with all the creeks and tributaries shining out. A flash of wonder in ordinary old Lethbridge. But my dear friend, still seated in the only chair in the house that he's comfortable in, saw none of it. He didn't even register the flash. He was looking in another direction, and he missed it all. That explains a lot, actually. Every day, looking in different directions, we see different things, are affected in different ways. No wonder we disagree, walk toward different things, live in different worlds. Having seen wonder, I look for it over and over again, even in ordinary old Lethbridge. But he didn't see it, and he doesn't find it. One of us looks into a computer screen, the other of us looks out the window. What worlds do we find? In what direction are you looking?
Lots to think about.
Well, these are the kinds of things that inspire me. This sense that there are these vignettes or moments in life that are really simple in themselves, but they end up saying a whole lot about either how we interact with each other, or where we might find some hope in moving on, or just finding life to be a little bit more intense in our ordinary old days.
Well, for those of you who are just tuning in, you are listening to Just FM and Just TV live from downtown Lethbridge. I am your producer host, Teri Petz, and my guest is Kat Charissage. Kat, are you friends with other poets?
I sure am. I'm friends with you. I actually didn't know a lot of other poets because, like many people, growing up and you go to the Chapters or some huge used bookstore and you're looking at all the poetry section and you're thinking, or I'm thinking, oh, this is great. Where do I start? So I pick something off the shelf and I read it and I don't get it. And then I feel stupid. And I feel like, whatever. But you just haven't found the right poets yet, is what I want to say. And so, as I have begun to find the poets that really speak to me, last year, a little over a year and a half ago, I started one of my story circles is called A Poet's Words, where the only demand, requirement, whatever, is that each person takes a meeting and helps us fall in love with the poetry that they love. So, Teri, you were part of my first group happening. We'll have a second group going this year. And in there, I was amazed by how many people secretly wrote poetry and really it was like finding that out about them. I just saw whole new areas of their lives that I had never seen before. After the group was over for the year, well, then you started with Poetry at the Owl, open mic once a month. And the variety of people and the variety of poetry is pretty phenomenal for a city this size.
Sure is.
Yeah. And what's wonderful is that instead of that open mic program being something where the published poets in town or the best poets in town are getting up there and being all avant-garde and challenging the audience with new works and things. Instead, people are getting up there, many for the very first time in public, to read their poetry. And everybody gets their 5 minutes, and everyone is welcomed as expressing something of themselves and that it is of value. Even if it's not particularly my cup of tea, I can happily listen to 5 minutes of that to encourage that person to be able to be more expressive in their lives. Through there, I've been meeting more poets, but I'd like to meet even more as we go on. I wanted to ask you, what about you? What has inspired you in your life of poetry, and has it been knowing other poets?
Well, it all started, of course, with by reading other people's poetry, but what inspires me mostly is nature and those little connections in life, just like for yourself, and also sometimes when I'm upset, I need to write it out. And then I don't have to yell and scream at anybody or call them names. And then after that, it just opens up for the creativity. But there's a poem I wrote about how my inspiration comes quite often. And it's one of my favorite poems, and it's called The Muse. Sometimes the muse comes and lures you to follow her wish, and you say, "Come on, I have other matters to attend," and she lets you do so. She nudges every once in a while with some clever thoughts she wants you to write down, and you like what she says, but you go on with your day. But if you keep ignoring her after many of her attempts, she uses the force of a child, throwing a nasty hissy fit, and you better pay attention and sit down and listen. You do not want to aggravate her. Just do as she says, and no one gets hurt. Then, as you sit and write, she calms down, and her beauty shines with every word that hits the page. And when you are done and you look at what you wrote, you think to yourself, "Why did I wait so long?"
I love that. I love that a lot. You were saying before that when you sit and write and you can get out some of your negative emotions without screaming and yelling or hitting anything or anybody. I've been a journal keeper for ever since I left home and felt that no one was going to read my journals is basically it. And what I have found is that lots of people say they don't like writing in journals because they go back to read it and all they find is that they're complaining about life. Well, that too has its purpose. You can close the book and it's over with. But what I want to encourage people to do sometimes is when they go back, find the phrases, find the images that stick out, and out of that create something of beauty. Mm-hmm. So I find that poetry making can often take what is the crap and extra garbage out of our life and compost it into something that is of beauty, either beauty as in nature or beauty as in being able to be of encouragement to another person. I'd like to read another poem of mine, if I could.
Please.
It's called Here I Am, too. My spouse and I have lots of books in our house. So many so that an engineering friend of mine said, have you got that house checked to make sure, the floors aren't going to collapse on you? But I say we put them all along the outside walls in their wonderful insulation. Okay. Anyway, so this particular poem started because I was sitting there. It was kind of the opposite of your Muse poem. I wanted to write something, but not much was coming, or at least I didn't think much was coming. So I sat there in silence for a while, and I just sat, and then it began to come. The house is quiet. Winter sunshine warms the room where hanging crystals throw tiny rainbows across the rows of books. Books, dusty books, hundreds of dusty books in front of me, thousands of dusty books in all the corners of my home. It's the books that bring so many people here into my home and my heart. There's so much to learn about you, and you, and you. I want to understand, or at least try to. What's it like for you? How's that working for you? How did you get through that war? What brought you to Canada, to Lethbridge of all places? What was it like for you after your husband died? What do you mean when you say you live in two worlds? Ah, yes. Okay. Wow. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's interesting. It wasn't like that for me, but here's what happened when, people's lives, people's stories, where we are, how we survive. For me, it's like finding the You Are Here sign on the map of the shopping mall. I want to know where you are in relation to me, what your time is like compared to mine now. Maybe this is why I've always been entranced by maps, any place, any size, and date books and calendars and timelines. Where am I in space and time? Where are you in space and time? Ultimately, we can be present to each other, and hopefully we can also become present for each other. In a big world, across centuries and millennia, I cry out, here I am, hoping to hear the response, here I am too.
Would you like to read another poem, Kat?
I'm so glad you asked. Excuse me here as I just find it. This one comes both from my work in sexual violence as well as from my own life. It was prompted by one of the questions we asked at the open mic as a prompt for people who wanted to write a poem. So the prompt was, write a poem on one of the things I used to think was true.
Oh, I remember that. And I have mine too.
Oh, good.
I'll read mine after that.
Okay. So that's the title of it. One of the things I used to think was true When I was 12, 13, I used to babysit, not only my 2 little brothers, but for a family or 2 in the neighborhood. I remember thinking how powerful I was. For a small portion of time, no one was bossing me, watching me, bugging me, yelling at me, finding work for me to do. I was the one in charge. For a small portion of time. I thought of all I could do if I wanted to. I could eat all the cookies in the cupboards, play with makeup, as long as I wiped it all off before the mom and dad got home, watch anything I wanted to on TV, play the stereo really loud. And oh yeah, the little kids? Well, I could boss them, bug them, yell at them. I could poke them, pinch them, ignore them. I could laugh at them, pull their hair, shove them aside. I could even hit them hard, over and over again if I wanted to. 'Cause they were little kids, right? They couldn't talk. They couldn't tell. Nobody would know. And they'd never remember it anyway. Isn't that what's great about really little kids? To make up for their crying and the stink, you could do whatever you wanted to them. They'd never remember it. Now, I never did do any of those things, though I probably would have eaten all the cookies if there'd been any to eat. No makeup, no forbidden TV shows, no screaming stereo, no screaming children either, because the one time I did hit my brother hard, I felt the slap too. I recognized the stinging red skin, not only on him, but on me too. And I remembered all the times I'd been slapped since way before I could talk. All the times I'd been pinched, screamed at, and then ignored. And all the times it had been even worse, way worse. I remembered. No, I watched little kid TV with my little kids. I read golden books and Disney stories. I read the illustrated Night Before Christmas all through the summers. I played Ring Around the Rosie, peekaboo, and hide and seek, and ignored them only when they were happy to be ignoring me. You see, one of the things I used to believe was true was that it didn't matter what you did to little kids because they'd never remember it. That you couldn't call anything abuse until they were old enough to tell, and that if you worked it right, they'd never call it abuse anyway because it was just ordinary life, ordinary mom and dad. I wonder where I learned all that. When I babysat, when I could finally do unto others what had been done unto me, I didn't, because I remembered. And I remembered how bad it hurt. But you know, I never put all that into words until I was in my 30s, working at a sexual assault center, that I'd been taught by those who loved me that it didn't matter what you did to little kids because they'd never remember it anyway. Oh, but it does matter. It really does matter what you do, and with all the little kids. Remember that.
Wow. I feel like we need to lighten the mood here.
Yes.
But I also would like to read my poem that was written on the same prompt. And maybe then we'll find something humorous.
Okay.
My poem is called The Mystery of Adults. One of the things I used to think was true, that adults knew everything. Everything. I used to ask them questions and expected appropriate answers. Sometimes all they said is, "Go away. Don't be a pest. I'm busy." Some of them, like my Uncle Joe, had the patience to educate a curious, inquisitive little girl, and I soaked up his knowledge like a sponge. He had an educated answer to whatever I asked him about. If he didn't know something, he said, "Let's look it up." And so we did. He had many, many interesting books, and we liked looking at them for answers. I remember the excitement I used to feel when I went to his apartment, and the awe I felt looking at his books. Years later, Uncle Joe and I talked, and he said, "I remember when you were a little girl, you wanted to know everything about life." I said, "Uncle Joe, I still do." One of the things I used to think was true is that when I finish school, I will know everything.
Yeah.
And when I finished school, you could not tell me anything because I knew it all. Then, as the years went by, I started to realize there was so much to learn. The curious, inquisitive little girl has grown into a curious, inquisitive woman. And I will learn and learn and learn until the day I die.
I love that one. Thank you. It reminds me that if education is actually working well, by the time you finish university, you should just know how much you don't know about the world and be a little bit more humble.
And that's exactly how it works. And I think that is called turning into a mature adult. Because, we can the numbers can go up, but the maturity may or may not go
That's
up.
right.
But I think that humility, did I say that right?
Yes.
When you realize how much you don't know and how much there is to learn, and if you keep that fire going, you will be that inquisitive person for the rest of your life, and
That's
you will
right.
learn and you will experience life the way it was supposed to be experienced. Do you have a funny poem for us?
Well, it may not be funny, but it's very heartwarming. So, I wrote this in July. It was at my sister-in-law's today. 5 baby wrens, chirping, calling, fussing. The parent birds never came back, probably caught by the neighborhood cats, or was it the neighborhood hawk? My sister-in-law couldn't let them starve. With her dear spouse, she brought them into the house. Huddled in the corner of the box, the 5 mouths that open larger than the size of their heads beg for life. We feed them mealworms from the pet store, every hour delivering them one by one with tiny tweezers. They yell for food every hour. Thankfully, they settled into a torpor at night until at least morning light. Bird School, the rehab facility in Calgary, will take them at the end of the week. They'll teach them to find their own worms on the ground and keep them safe till they have a chance in the wild. Every spring life is so extravagant. Trees don't have a dozen leaves, but thousands. Wrens don't lay 3 eggs, but 7, who are now the 5 chicks in the box in the bedroom. An abundance of chances at life. But such waste, too, as not all life will grow or mature. It would have been natural to let the baby wrens starve, or to let some predator make a meal of them. Yet it makes my heart glad that when we hear the chirps of hungry little birds, most of us do what we can to help, do what we can to lessen the suffering right in front of us. May this always be so. Mm-hmm.
That reminds me of our blue jays.
Of our what?
Blue jays.
Oh, tell me.
They come to our backyard. We feed them peanuts. They have a little bench that I made for them for the peanut feast. And if we don't get up early enough, they come to the window and they start chirping and complaining until we open the door and take the peanuts out.
That's a happy story.
Yes, there's lots of those in Lethbridge. Now, at the Owl Poetry, we have this lady called Sonia, And Sonia always looks so proper and so well behaved and elegant and intelligent. And she reads these funny poems that crack everybody up. And one day she kind of inspired me to write something. And it's sort of written to the people who are getting into that aging, and sometimes it's hard to handle the challenges that go with aging. So this is called Young at Heart. Young at heart, other parts in desperate need of repair. Your blood pressure medicine gives you insomnia, and the insomnia meds gave you ulcers eons ago. Your bed is now like an Olympic ski slope, but your indigestion is still irritating your throat. You used to party all night 3-4 times a week and still be functional with 3 hours of sleep. Now, pain gets you up and down like a yo-yo all night, and you feel like a zombie day after day from the lack of a good night's sleep. Some days the cocktail of medications is as strong as the drugs you used to have in the 60s, but the hallucinations are not as colorful as they used to seem on LSD. You tried the elimination diet to determine what foods to avoid, and you had some weird discoveries between a gummed-up state and a rapid elimination with smells that could be used for mass destruction or state-of-the-art torture tools by the CIA. Some days, you can only leave the house with the toilet chained to your butt, but you are young at heart, with some parts in desperate need of repair. Your skin is beyond hope and repair. No amount of lotion will make it tight like it was once upon a time. The lines on your face are as deep as the Grand Canyon, and you covered your gray hair for years. You spend hours trying to find the receipt you need to email for reimbursement, and you are convinced that the same people that keep taking single socks from the dryer have taken your receipt, and one day you open the scanner and there it is. They must have returned it when you were asleep.
Mm-hmm.
You mix up the names of your children, grandchildren, the dogs, the cats, and birds you had when you were a child. The languages you once spoke fluently are blended into your own secret language no one else in the world can understand. And despite all of this, you keep going, you keep smiling, and you learn to laugh in times you really wanted to cry. Your sense of humor kept you sane in an insane and cruel world because you are young at heart with some parts in desperate need of repair.
I love that one. It's so true.
People who are just tuning in, we would like to let you know you are listening to Jess FM and Jess TV, live from downtown Lethbridge. I am your producer host, Teri Petz, and this is my guest, Kat Charissage. Kat, your turn for a new poem now.
Okay. Well, lots and lots of people, and one of my favorite authors, Mary Oliver, are inspired by nature. Well, I'm somebody who, when I go outside in the sun, it burns my skin and it gives me a headache, and then I perspire, and then there's all kinds of bugs that are all over me, and I come in and I find weird rashes and stuff. Let's just put it this way. You won't find me on a 4-day hike into the woods.
All right, I won't take you then.
Yeah, thank you. She and her spouse just went and got a Christmas tree out of the real mountains and brought it back, and it's a real fresh tree right in their living room. Anyway, but I also know that you don't have to go far to know the world that we live in. And it's also a matter of looking. Sometimes I get so frustrated because I live in a lovely little home on the north side of Lethbridge, which is 1970s suburbia. I grew up in 1970s suburbia, and all I wanted to do was to get out. Downtown Toronto is much more my cup of tea. But here I am, and we're making a good life here. But what I don't have is either the downtown excitement and diversity of Toronto, but I also don't have the country, and I don't have a lot of trees, and I don't have beautiful sunsets that I can see from my home. But let me tell you what I do have. Wildness has visited. It snowed again. It's been a hell of a spring this year. Yet the white blanket sparkling in the sunshine is pretty. Underneath the crabapple tree, though, the snow is all trampled, and chocolate droppings are now fertilizing the lawn. What a mess! The deer have visited in the night. Hungry, they're cleaning up the last of the crab apples. I don't know where they come from. Those deer had to walk through a lot of city neighborhoods to get to my house. It thrills me, though, thinking of their presence, blessing my neighborhood of little boxes all in a row. Wildness has visited, anointing my front yard. Invisible, persistent, the wild is surviving, finding what is needed to keep going on. You know, long time ago, holy people would wear headdresses of deer antlers. The antlers, branching towards the heavens, became a tree of life to ascend to the spirits. The antlers reach out to pick up new ideas on the wind. The antlers plow through deep snow, making way for others to go on their way, creating paths to food and survival. My dear crabapple-eating deer, show me how to climb the tree of life. Teach me to pick up new ideas floating round my head. Remind me to make way, to find soul food and survival, and to leave the paths for others to find their way too. Dear wild, wild deer, come find us in our little boxes all in a row. Show me how to, like you, spark hope with the mess made while you clean up, use up all the leftover abundance. All the leftover abundance all around us, right in front of our noses. What's particularly wonderful about this is that I had this experience, I wrote this poem, and about 3 or 4 days later, I was at my sister-in-law's, the one who had saved the family of baby wrens. And I was telling them that I really like deer. You know, I don't like coming across them at dusk in the car, but I like deer. And I said a little bit about the headdresses of the antlers and stuff. And my brother-in-law says to me, "Oh, I've got something that you might like." And he went out into his yard where they had used as a kind of a garden ornament. He had found there are people who hike all over the place, all over the world. But he had found a skull of a deer with the antlers still connected. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Oh, would you like this?" And so now in my room, in my study, I've got right in the window, the two antlers branching up. And every time I look at them, I think of the poem, I think of synchronicities, and I think of the reaching out for goodness and wisdom and hope, which is what poetry does for me.
Well, and that reminds me of a funny story about you.
Uh-oh.
Yes, well, you sent out an email or an invitation, and then a bunch of emails went back and forth between us group members for the
Poet's Words?
The Poet's Words. And one of the ladies said, "Yes, Cat, the poetic cat herder."
Yeah, you can't herd cats. They don't like to do what you want them to do. And that same way with adult women. You get a room full of adult women, and all you could do is kind of sit back and gently suggest, maybe.
Are we that bad?
No, you're that good. It's so interesting. I prepare everything in great detail, actually. And but I know as soon as everybody assembles, that throw it all out, and as different things come up, well, that kind of connected with what I wanted to say or wanted to present, so that's when I bring it up. Anyway, it's actually a lot of fun.
Good. I'm glad you enjoy it, because we sure enjoy being a member there. And it does bring us a lot of inspiration and a deep connection. And I really wish I had Jill's haiku here, that explained it so well, that we connect on a deep level when we're in these poetry circles. And that reminds me, I'd like everybody to know that if you like poetry, and you would like to hear and see more local poets, you can join us for open mic at the Owl Acoustic Lounge on December 27th from 7 to 9 p.m. That is the day after Boxing Day. So to beat the Boxing Day blues, you can come in and hear some poems. The Owl is located at 411 3rd Avenue South. You can also connect with us on Facebook by searching for Lethbridge Poetry. And I think it would be great if you would read another poem, Kat. Do you have anything lined up?
Yeah, I do. This is another one of the poems that came on a day when nothing was coming. I know some poets, and I envy them, that they feel, well, as you said in your Muse poem, that the words just come and they're right there on the page. And for me, they come after I sit for a while.
So you need that quietness.
I need the quiet.
The contemplation.
Yeah. It's called Ordinary Day. I show up with pen and paper anyway, even with nothing to say. The Muse is visiting, but not with me. Any good ideas anywhere? I look around. No. Just an ordinary day. My tummy is full from a hot breakfast, plenty of protein. The quiet house warm. The comfy bed calling me back to its embrace. Wet hair, drying after a long hot shower. That's my ordinary. Good food, plenty. Indoor plumbing, reliable. Central heating, cozy. Water, hot at the tap, enough to pour over dear body over and over and over again. But only a few centuries ago, these were not so ordinary. Not even for kings and queens. And not so ordinary even now for children in refugee camps, for migrants walking 1,000 miles towards safety, for the homeless here in Lethbridge sleeping under the overpass. My ordinary day is really not quite so ordinary. My ordinary day of warmth, comfort, enoughness. Extraordinary, isn't it? Dear Muse, welcome home.
Wow.
It's so easy, especially at a time like now. Seeing the commercials on TV, walking around the malls, to see all that is out there that we, quote unquote, could have. And so we end up thinking of ourselves as always in a lack of, always not enough of. If only I had this, if only I could go on that cruise, if only whatever. And I remember when I was homeschooling my son, I thought a lot about how can I help him know how fortunate we are. And it's so funny because he calls my poetry, it's definitely mom poetry. But I didn't want him to have that roll of the eyes every time I would say something like, oh, we're so fortunate in what we have. But I came across that clue. He loves history. And so when we would talk about the kings and the queens and their power, or the kinds of conquests, and he was into knights and swords and all that kind of stuff. It's surprising what kind of creativity you can come up with as a mom when your 6-year-old kid really wants a gladiator outfit, and you've got, 4 pieces of poster board and some duct tape? Anyway. But I remember talking to him about that, saying, what did those soldiers, how did they sleep at night? Did they have, or the march through Russia by Napoleon's soldiers, not very many of them came back alive. The Russians didn't have to fight, they just let winter do its work. And then I talk about the kings and the queens and talk about how they had the tapestries on the walls. And I would say, that's not just for artwork, although it was for artwork as well, but it was to keep the drafts out, They didn't have the kinds of books that we've got here at home. They didn't have those to insulate the walls, and those castles were drafty. And every once in a while I turned the heat off just for him to know what it felt like not to have heat in the house for an hour or two. But yeah, I appreciate indoor plumbing.
Well, and you obviously appreciate a lot of other things, and I'm sure there's insulation in the walls, but I never heard that function for books to use them as insulation.
Yeah, you have to have a lot to be very complete, wall to wall, floor to ceiling.
And you do have that.
We always joke that my son, after my spouse and I are passed, that he'll be able to open a used bookstore.
Yes, he definitely could. Yes. I'd like to share a poem I recently wrote. And I believe I also read it at the Owl. And if I repeat myself, I'm sorry. It's called The World Wide Web. And we're so obsessed with our dinner shots and our travel shots and the glamorous shots. And this was sort of an antidote to all that. So it's called the World Wide Web. Don't tell me what you had for dinner, and don't show me your expensive brand name clothes or accessories. I don't care about them. I don't care about your opinion of corrupt politicians or the dysfunctions in the world either. Tell me about a day you carried a friend home on your back because she broke her arm. Nobody made you a hero for it, but that is something I care about. I also want to know about the time you had enough of the burdens and hardships life presented you. You felt you just can't take it anymore and were ready to scream, but something inside you stopped you from screaming, and calmness surrounded you. I want to hear about how you reached calmness. I want to hear about the time you stopped cars on the street from driving over a little bird, confused on its maiden flight, moments after leaving its nest. Show me a picture of your elderly relative gleaming from joy because you visited him or her. That's what I want to see. And when you focus on the things that matter, and what you do makes your world a better place, no matter how small or big that world may be, then the web of the world will widen, and you can smile because you did what you had to do.
Thank you. It reminds me of a quote from Mary Oliver when she says, "For poems are not words after all, but fires for the cold, ropes let down to the lost, something as necessary as bread in the pockets of the hungry."
I love it. No wonder so many of us like Mary Oliver. And to listeners who are just tuning in, you are listening to Jess FM and Jess TV, live from downtown Lethbridge. I am your producer host, Teri Petz, And this is my guest, Kat Charissage. Kat, do you have another poem for us?
We still have time, eh?
Like it.
Okay. I have a weeping willow. When I lived in the country, I had a weeping willow tree in the backyard. It was a mother tree, nurturing me and everyone else who came to that sanctuary called Sage Woods. Under that willow, I had a swing that could hold 3 of us, or embrace the one of me all sprawled out. Back and forth, a cradle in the woods. I went through a lot when I lived there, and that willow tree witnessed much weeping, cradling a broken heart, a broken dream. When the breezes came, the branches danced, and the leaves sang. When the storms came, the branches writhed and the leaves snapped, whips striking the ground, the trunk, the air. But deeply, deeply rooted with supple, tender branches, that willow tree never broke. It sang, it wept, it writhed, but it never broke. That willow tree sang, it wept, it writhed, but it never, ever broke. I learned to be me from that tree.
Yes, Kat, you're a willow. The unbreakable.
Well, I don't need any more challenges on that.
No, I don't think you do.
Okay, this reminds me of something that I wished I had known when I was a young person. So I'm going to ask you first. What do you wish you could tell your younger self, if anything?
Wow. That I have more strength than I ever imagined. That I can endure anything. And that love is the answer to everything. Some people say our actions and our words either come from fear or from love.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be just the 2 basic emotions. And there's a lot of other layers. But I realized that whenever my thoughts and my actions come from love, everybody's happy, including myself.
Oh, I wished you told me that when I was 15.
I wish I knew you then. We would have been friends, and we would have probably hung off the willow branches like I did when I was a little girl.
Yeah.
We will
swinging.
We grabbed a bunch of the willow branches, and we swung like little monkeys.
Like Tarzan.
Yes.
I think if I could say anything to my younger self, I would start out with what you said. You're stronger than you think. And the other is that it gets better. It really can get better. And if you're in a situation, as I was in, where you couldn't get out, you couldn't get out at the time, make your plans. Plot your escape, and when it's time, go ahead and live life.
Those are great words to close. We are coming to an end, I believe. You were listening to us live from Lethbridge. You can download our free app on Android and iPhone, or by going to jessfm.ca. We were also live on YouTube and on Facebook. And you listened to For the Love of Poetry with myself, Teri Petz, and Kat Charissage. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching us. Have a great weekend.